Hello everyone, welcome to the pilot episode of Stained Glass Attitudes on YouTube. This episode I travel to Cumbria, north-east of the famous Lake District, to three extraordinary churches, each representing a different period in the expansion of liturgical architectural space. Shall we begin? Oh, fuck! Typical. Yeah, luckily I've been here before, so I can actually show you some good pictures of what this church actually looks like when it doesn't have all this probably necessary scaffolding all over it. The key thing that's significant, and mostly covered up on the outside today, is the central tower. A central tower was a big fad particular to English parish churches during the 12th century, but it led to no end of problems, as we'll see inside. The site of the central tower inside Barton Church is not easily forgotten. It has two round arches suspended above two wide segmental arches. Why would you build something like this? Well, the answer is you wouldn't. Originally, the north and south sides of the tower were open to the weather. You can see the former exterior window from what is now the south aisle, and from under the tower itself. When the church was first built in the 12th century, it would have simply had two chambers, west and east of the tower, a long unaisled nave to the west, and a small cell to the east, like this roughly contemporary, but much grander church, Stukely in Buckinghamshire. From the 13th century onwards, arcades were commonly added to naves to increase the breadth of the church. This would have removed the firmer abutment of the solid wall, you can see the remains of it here, with these fancy but less sturdy Gothic columns. Now this arcade is alarmingly wonky, showing the thrust of the tower against it. That's why, sometime in the 14th century, the bottom parts of the tower arches were cut away and replaced with these segmental arches to help stabilise the tower. It's not unlike the arches under the crossing tower at Wells Cathedral that were installed in 1337, which you may remember from my great mistakes in medieval architecture. Subscribe. Central towers seem to have been desirable for a relatively short period in the English parish church. Originally, the small space under the tower would have been the liturgical centre of the church, with the altar in that central position. But soon there would be a demand for larger areas in front of the high altar, and central towers became a liability and, quite frankly, a pain in the arse. We're now going to journey to a church which shows the next stage in the development of the English parish church, the long chancel. Oh, I'm not that keen about stopping there, it looks a bit boring to me. Oop, there we go. Made out of local stone though. Ooh, Dacre is quaint. Ooh, telephone box. There's a game I like to play with these. I call it library or defibrillator. Oh, it's still got a phone in it. And not a trace of tramp urine. That house is nice. Shame about the windows, though. Plastic windows! So just down the road from Barton is Dacre. A monastery was recorded at Dacre in the 8th century by none other than the Venerable Bede, and again one is mentioned in the 10th century. And remarkably, physical artefacts still exist from these establishments. The sculptural fragments from these long-lost Anglo-Saxon monasteries at Dacre are really something quite special. Usually fragments of earlier churches are like, oh, a 12th century chevron voussoir, how interesting. but these are seriously fascinating pieces of sculpture. The larger fragment is part of the shaft of a monumental cross. It is carved with iconography showing the sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham, Adam and Eve with the tree of knowledge, and many mysterious beasts which are usually accredited to the influence of Viking art. The sculpture is, bluntly, a little bit crude, but this shows us that this originated from the 10th century monastery after the chaos caused by the Viking invasions of Britain. It contrasts with the magnificent quality of the smaller fragment. This dates from the early 9th century, so around 800, therefore plausibly associated with that first monastery existing in Bede's time. Also likely a cross shaft, it has intricate patterns around a winged beast, with a curiously human expression. The sculpture can be associated with the revival of forms from classical antiquity that were happening in the Carolingian Empire in France around 800, testament of the close connection of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms with continental Europe.
Oh my, did he really just use me to make a Brexit reference? How embarrassing.
It really is spectacular evidence of the sophistication of these early British monastic communities. Dacre's parish church is extremely interesting today for its long chancel, probably built around the year 1200. It represents the next stage in the architecture of parochial liturgy, after the restricted, centralised plan that we saw at Barton. The chancel is 3 bays long, with the windows still having round arches, but large enough to be considered foreshadowing early Gothic. Now, it's not unusual to come across a chancel this large in an English church from the 14th or 15th century, but in the late 12th, it really is remarkable to have a space in a parish church given over to the liturgy, which is this huge, over 12 metres long. Now, it cannot be a coincidence that this remarkably precocious piece of architecture is but a stone's throw from the seat of the powerful Dacre family, now occupied by this much knocked about but essentially 14th century tower keep. The Dacres probably refounded the site of the ancient monastery as a parish church, but with a larger than usual complement of clergy provided. This would essentially make it a very early collegiate foundation, of which an example can be found at our next destination.
Welcome to Greystoke. It's not twinned with anywhere weird in France that you've never heard of. To be fair, I'm pretty sure no one in France has heard of Greystoke. Well, clearly they haven't, because they didn't twin with them.
So this church is totally on a different scale.
Look at this absolute unit!
Now, I said that Dacre was possibly endowed with a large number of clergy by the local nobs, but Greystoke definitely had collegiate status, as by the 14th century you needed to have permission from the crown to set one up. The college was established by William, the 14th Baron Greystoke. After a good 30 years wrangling with King Edward, he finally got permission from Richard II in 1382. Yes, once again, there's a big fancy church next to a fancy 14th century castle. Initially, the church was staffed by a master, 7 chaplains, and 6 chantry priests. Their job would be to say the Mass and the liturgical hours every day for the souls of those at Greystoke Castle in this large chancel. Now, this building actually has nothing to do with 1382. It's mostly late 15th century, the chancel, and early 16th century, the nave, and it seems very possible that building work just kept going on well after the Reformation, which is incredibly unusual in England and something you only ever really get up north. Inside, you can see the remains of the pre-collegiate parish church that are preserved inside the new walls. The round columns are probably late 12th century. They're much darker, red sandstone, a dead giveaway that they were quarried centuries earlier than the rest of the church. There's an offset pair of arches, with features implying a date of around 1200 that perhaps once supported a vanished central tower. The new aisles are extraordinarily large, over 7 metres, a whole metre wider than the central vessel, showing how the 16th century parishioners were desperate to extend their original constricted nave. The liturgical heart of the college, however, was the chancel, and this one retains much of its original furnishings and fittings that show how it was used in its heyday. Very becoming for a collegiate church, it has a set of these. Now, if you know a little about my career, you'll know that I know a fair bit about these things. My PhD was on sedilia, and they are the seats for the priest, the deacon, and the subdeacon. Sedilia were used during Mass at the points where the priest and his assistants didn't have anything to do, so kept them out of the way of the high altar. They were a luxury feature. You could easily just have a wooden bench that performed the same function, but if you had the money, it's a good idea to have these features so that you always encourage High Mass to be said by the full complement of clergy. At the other end of the chancel are a very different type of liturgical seating, for the members of the college either attending a Mass or, more importantly, for them to recite the hours from, the choir stalls. Now, a lot of people who go around churches get really excited when they see medieval stalls because they often have these hidden carvings under the seats. Misericords, as they are called, contain surprisingly random scenes, often quite bawdry, but appropriate for being underneath a priest's bottom. Here, a virgin with a unicorn putting its horn in a lap, so a man can capture it. And here's a more everyday scene of a horse being shoed. Although some of these stalls are original, like those misericords in this beautiful corner piece, a lot of it, and a lot of the misericords, are 17th century and Victorian. Now, the reason that they have these very intricate folding seats is because these stalls were as much for standing in as sitting in. If you've ever been to church, you'll know there's a lot of, "Oh, let us stand," and then they just keep talking and go on and on and on and on. That's just if you go on a Sunday. If you had to go to the readings of the hours 8 times a day, every day, you can imagine how tired you'd get standing. So with this you can just sort of pretend to stand. Hence the mercy of the misericord. The jewel of this church is the late 15th century east window, a showpiece that most of our churches had destroyed in the Reformation and afterwards. Much of it was taken to the castle in 1790, and it was only reassembled here in 1848. What's wonderful about it is how close you can get up to it, a piece of art for the place in which it was designed over 500 years ago. While a lot of the window is made up of a jumble of fragments from elsewhere in the church, the main narrative panels survive quite well, albeit with some restoration, such as this head here, which is Victorian. They tell the story of the patron saint of Greystoke, St. Andrew, some scenes from the Gospels, but also his further adventures rescuing Matthew from some cannibals, which was held in little more esteem than fan fiction by the 15th century, but whatever, it's a bit of fun. So in Cumbria, we've seen, in but a few square miles, how church architecture and culture changed through the Middle Ages. First there was Barton, with its distinctive but cramped liturgical core under a central tower, as was typical in the century after the Norman conquest. Then at Dacre, around the year 1200, on the site of an important Anglo-Saxon monastery, the local lords probably encouraged the building of a precociously long chancel to encourage new, more sophisticated forms of parochial liturgy for the sake of their souls. And finally at Greystoke, we saw the late medieval gentry going all out, founding a formal college of priests and providing them with a grand chancel fitted out with furniture and art to help them pray in perpetuity for their souls. There's 1,000 more stories like this out there, so join me next time in the next exciting episode of Stained Glass Attitudes. So if you've been spurred to visit these churches, remember to sign the guest book to let them know that you've been, and put some money in the donation box. Well, not to pee, but that's all I have. What do you think of it so far?
Rubbish.